Hello, my name is David Robertson, and this is another educational video from artistblacksmith.com. And today I will be showing you how to make a dragon-headed door handle. And I'll talk about forging the face and the body, the tail section, and I'll discuss the back plate as well. And this handle is appropriate for a front door or a door to your shop, anything like that. So I started with two pieces of steel. The one on the bottom is 3/4 by 1 by 9 inches long, and the one on the top is 1/4 by 2.5 by 14 inches long. These are both mild steel, and the bottom one, which I start with first, I'm working the head structure on the thick side. And you'll see this in the video. It'll make more sense in a minute. So first I get the bar good and hot. I want to be up at the yellows. And I'm creating the step for the forehead. I'm using the near edge of the anvil, and the hammer is actually coming down half on, half off the anvil. And you'll see a couple times I have to go through this because it is quite a thick bar. You can see a bit of a forehead develop there. You have to work the bar quite hot to be able to manipulate it nicely. Otherwise you're just straining yourself and you're not getting anywhere. I'm refining the nose a little bit because there is a swelling that happens as I hammer down on the forehead. Lots of different ways of creating the dragon's face. This is just one of them. You can see it's starting to develop there. So I usually create this single cut, if you will, or single step for the forehead. And this places the eyes on the front. Some people will do two diagonals, and that will place the eyes more on the side. And it changes the look of the dragon's head, but exactly the same procedure. Just rounding the corners of the nose a little bit so it's a little bit softer. Now here I'm using a guillotine fuller, and this is to create a notch top and bottom on the steel. And this is just fabricated together, it's just welded up. Very useful tool, I use it quite often. And this is to create the definition between the jaw and the back of the head and what becomes the neck of the dragon. This also allows something for the vise to clamp onto so that you're not constantly sliding out when you're working with the punches on the face. And I turn it over, I work both sides evenly. I want a fairly good notch set in, and of course keep everything straight as you go. And then I switch over to the air hammer, and what I'm doing is pulling out the neck portion so I've got something to grab onto with the vise. And I take my time and I work all the sides. The heaviest blows are in the same plane as what I did with the fullering tool, the shouldering tool. And I stretch it out a little bit. At this point I'm really just worrying about what I can grab onto with the vise. And you can see the indent there. So there's 4 different punches I actually use for creating the dragon's head, and we'll get a close-up of those in a second. So the furthest right is a sharp splitting chisel, the next one is a rounded finger punch, the one to the left again is a fairly sharp center punch, and then the last one is an eyeball punch. The eyeball punch actually has a concave center, so when you hammer into the steel, it creates a protruding eyeball. So here we're at the vise. I'm going to start work. And I like a vise that has a good crisp edge on the top for doing this. And the other thing it does with all the hammering is it will define the jawline. So at this point I'm using the center punch, and this is really to start the eyes. And I work in, and you'll see I'll change angle a little bit the deeper I go, basically pulling the steel out to create the flare for the eye socket. And you can also see how fast the vise sucks the heat out. That's the center punch. So this is a constant return to the fire. You do a little bit of work, back to the fire, a little bit of work, back to the fire. And you get some eyes developing. It comes pretty quick. So once again, clamped in the vise. And you can see more of the angle now, which way I'm working. And you see how it also slides down in the vise until it locks in on that jawline. I'm literally sculpting in, prying the steel out with the chisel until I get the flare, the desired flare I want. And you can get quite a significant flare if you work with this. Take your time. A little bit of a close-up here this time. Now my camera does shift the colors a little bit. Although that looks like it's white hot, it's actually just up in the bright yellows. Now I'm working with the rounded finger punch, and that's really to sculpt and flare the eye sockets. The center punch almost cuts, and then the rounded punch really just pushes the metal kind of out of the way. So if you want to move metal quickly, use the center punch, and then come back in to do your final sculpting with the rounded punch. So here I've used the bandsaw to split the jaw off. That gives that very clean line on the bottom. You could use a splitting chisel, just takes a little bit more effort. What I'm primarily looking for is the clean finish. I will be forging the jaw, but I wanted to separate it now before I started working on the nose. So here I'm back into the clamp, and I'm going to use the slitting chisel to pry open the jaw. Just some light taps. And essentially I'm getting it out of the way. Cleaning up the bottom of the cut, and then a few hammer taps just to drop it down, and that'll make it easier to work on as I stretch it out. Lots of variations on jaw structure too. You can do teeth on the jaw. You can do what I'm doing, where I just simply pull it straight out, obviously using the cross beam, and thins it out, and then I'll end up folding it back into the jaw. All kinds of variations. Just play around, let your imagination go with some of this stuff. There is no one right way of making a dragon. These are all just techniques that you can adapt to create your own personal style. So I keep pulling it out, stretching it out. I essentially want enough of a triangle that I can fold it back on itself. can see it's beginning to develop. You can see there's a jaw, you see a little bit of the face structure. So back into the vise. Of course, you always have to work quickly because everything's cooling down, the vise is stealing heat, the air is stealing the heat. So this is the center punch, and I'm really just getting the nose started at this point. Mostly so I've got something I can go back into on the next heat. And this is a long process, something that shouldn't be rushed. The more care you take, the more developed you can get with the face. And it doesn't have to be a dragon, it can be virtually anything, any creature, mythical creature, a living creature. Back in again. And I might mention with this, these are sort of light, snappy blows on the hammer on the punch. I'm not really trying to hammer hard. I'm more letting the repetition do the work. So this will give you a look at the nose. And you can see the face structure is starting to develop now. It's got a long bottom jaw, nose, and then the eye sockets. You can do this on smaller bar. The problem is your heat dissipates so fast, you may get very frustrated with it. I've worked on 1/2" bar and I've worked on 3/8. And certainly for the time I get out of the 3/4 by 1 or 1" square bar, much easier to work with, even though it is bigger bar. You just have a longer heat. So working again to flare those nostrils, digging in a little bit deeper. And it's the same sort of thing as the eye sockets. You want to spend some time on it, really define these things. So that's working with the rounded punch. And here the nose will want to bend over, so you try and do a couple strokes one way, a couple strokes the other way to straighten the nose all the way along. If it does get really bent, it is better to correct early on than to continue doing the work with it bent, because it just makes it worse. So still working with the rounded punch. You can see it clearly there. So on this dragon I wanted teeth on the top jaw. So obviously he's upside down right now. And I use a very sharp slitting chisel to actually cut in the teeth. And you have to do this hot. You want to be up in the bright yellows, otherwise you just don't have enough time to get them cut. You could cut this cold with an angle grinder or a bandsaw. I like the form that develops by cutting it hot. And essentially I can just pull the tooth right off. You see a little bit standing up there. This is another reason why I like the tapered jaw, because it's out of the way when I go to do this cut for the top teeth. So I can get in with the corner of the chisel. And this is really all I'm using. I'm using probably about 1/4 inch of the chisel, the slitting chisel at the one side. And as you go, you can see I'm prying up on the last few hits just to pull the jaw out, or pull the tooth out. Same idea for the ears. The only difference here is that I've got the little piece of scrap bar underneath to act as a support. And if I cut longer off, I would be able to change the ears into horns. Again, it's just what your preference is, what type of work you want to do, what type of shape you want to end up with. You can see he's starting to take a little bit of form now. It's recognizable as a dragon. Keep working those ears. I find each one of these has their own character. You can do 10 of them using the same techniques, and each one has a slightly different expression. So, curling that jaw around, tucking it back into position. And I'm just using a small pair of scrolling pliers. You can start to see his face there. So now I'll switch around, and I'm going to draw out what becomes the actual handle portion. And I'm going to leave a blob on the end of the bar, and that's what I forged down to create his tail. So this is just a regular draw out. I am trying for a taper from the neck back to the blob, because a dragon would taper that way. It would be larger at the front and then small right at the tail. And this takes a few cycles with the air hammer, but much easier than working it by hand. I'm also getting rid of the corners. Again, this is a handle, so it's essentially a tool. Anything that I'm hanging onto or somebody's hanging onto, I want a nice rounded, comfortable surface for them to grab onto, not something sharp that will get in the way of their hand. And this takes a few passes. It's good to have some sort of idea of how much steel you're going to soak up for whatever size handle. As I said in the beginning, I used a 14-inch back plate, and I had pre-measured things to know that I was going to need the amount of steel in the dragon to have a solid handle, but at the same time have enough to create the reversing curves that I wanted. So you can see how I've left that sort of blob on the end, and I hammer up to it, but then I go away from it. I'll end up refining the tip, doing some point work and some shouldering on it, just to define the tail spade a little bit more prominently. Again, taking the corners off. The beauty with working with organic shapes, if you will, there's the shouldering tool again, is nobody can say that dragons don't have a spade tail, or that the spade tail should be smaller or larger or whatever. It's your interpretation. So here's the shouldering just to define that tail a little bit more. And it's not deep, it's more or less just to create a sharp transition. So put the bar back in the fire and just warm it up a little bit so I can do some hand refinement on that transition area. And really all it is just tapering it in. again, I'll knock the corners off this. Now this actually isn't handle portion down here, it's more decorative, but the whole thing has to flow. Again, refining the blob on the tail. And then I start flattening. And I'm using a 3-pound hammer right now. Eventually I'll switch over to a rounding hammer, and that will define the lobes a little bit better than the flat hammer. It's using the rounding hammer. And as I work with that, the near lobe, I'm using a diagonal or a rotational stroke towards me. The far lobe, I'm using a diagonal or a rotational stroke away from me. And you can see it's starting to develop. It's a fairly thick piece of steel, so it does take a series of heats to develop. And I'm trying to leave a crease down the center line. I like that look on these as opposed to just a flat plate. And if you use specialty dies under your air hammer, you could certainly do it that way as well. In this particular case, I like the control by the hand, and it really only takes me a few extra heats. You can see it's starting to develop now. And there's a good image of it. You can see the center crease down the side. I've evened up the lobes on both sides. The point's right in the center. Now I'm going to actually bend the handle shape. And I'm using a set of bending forks to do this. You'll see my anvil bouncing around a fair bit, and I didn't really realize this when I was working on the piece until I looked at the video. And it's quite true that if your anvil is mounted securely, you're going to be much more efficient with working at it. I've just naturally adapted to it. But after looking at some of the videos, especially this one where my anvil's all out of position, I thought, maybe it's time that I upgrade the stand for my anvil. And in future videos you'll see that it is a different construction. So again, same thing, working with the bending forks. And I'm creating this sort of S-bend so that the dragon faces out. There's a flat portion for the handle and then an S-bend going back to the back plate. And I have to be quite careful here that I'm not hammering right on the face. Obviously I'd end up distorting the nose or the eye sockets or squishing the ears. There's a good example. So I've done the other bending on the bottom and the tail. And I want to end up with the two bends so it will sit on the plate and have enough space for a person to get their hand in. And you can see I've achieved that. So a little bit of flow to the body, and I can put that aside. Now I start working on the back plate. Now this is the back plate finished with a hole drilled in it to do a plug weld to attach the handle to the back plate. I thought I had some clips of actually forging out the back plate, but I couldn't find them. Pretty simple. I place it in the forge and I'm working with the rounding hammer to create the texture all along the edge. And then I'm using a curved cutting chisel, like a gouge, to cut the corners off from the front. And that's how I create this design. This is a front view of the finished piece. So I've plug welded top and bottom where the handle attaches to the back plate. I'm a big fan of using plug welds. They hide things. Alternatively, I could have done a traditional rivet through or a collar, all kinds of possibilities to create the same structure. So at this point it's been wire wheeled and assembled, and then the next step would just be clear coating it, and it would be ready to deliver to the customer. Play around with dragon's heads or animal heads, and you'll certainly be able to come up with your own innovations. This is just giving you some samples. Very simple tools, very simple techniques working with the anvil. A little bit of a heavy draw out under the air hammer. You could still do that by hand. That's not a big issue. Lots of possibilities. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and for more information on different techniques, please see artistblacksmith.com. There's a lot of extra information that's not in the video. So take care, and we'll talk to you again. Bye for now.